America says it loves free speech. We love it right up until somebody says something ugly, dangerous, offensive, or politically useful to the other side. Then, suddenly, everybody becomes a procedural genius about why this particular speech is different. In this conversation with Jonathan Rauch, we get into why that instinct is so dangerous, why universities got lost between truth seeking and the safety bureaucracy, why neither party should be trusted with the power of censorship, and why institutions are a lot easier to wreck than to rebuild. Jonathan Rauch has spent decades thinking about free thought, liberal democracy, Christianity, civic virtue, and the machinery that keeps a free society from tearing itself apart. This is not a conversation about whether you like free speech. It is about whether or not you still believe in the rules when they protect somebody else's speech that you cannot stand. This is the big questions. Let's get into it. America says it wants more democracy, more transparency, and more freedom. But what if some of the very reforms meant to clean up politics have actually helped hollow out the institutions that made liberal democracy work in the first place? My guest today has spent decades arguing that free speech, party machinery, truth seeking norms, and even Christian civic virtue matter far more than modern elites and populists alike want to admit. He's a senior fellow at Brookings, a contributing writer at The Atlantic, and the author of several books, including Kindly Inquisitors, The Constitution of Knowledge, and Cross Purposes. Everyone, please welcome Jonathan Rauch to the Big Questions. Jonathan, thank you for joining us today.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, and first of all, I want to say I really appreciate the way you approach issues. I find that sort of balance and openness to possibly contrasting ideas in the pursuit of just trying to find something workable is something to be lauded, and it's not something we see typically in today's environment.
Thank you.
I just want to touch very quickly to give folks a very brief introduction. You're a Yale graduate with a history degree, as I understand it, and you got into journalism initially. So, just early on, what was there any particular incident or situation that kind of led you as you started off on your journalism track or your journalism career, I should say, because it came after you graduated? That said, "Hey, I'm more interested in understanding these underlying institutions and how they function, as opposed to reporting events and interpreting specific events as part of say, a journalist's path."
Oh, what a great and big question. I got interested in history and philosophy of science in college, and that's a piece of it. But the closest thing to a breakthrough, this will sound odd, John. Is that what people call you, John, Big John?
John is fine. Yeah, no, that's fine. John is fine. Yep. Big
Um,
John is an old radio moniker that I've just have not been able to shake, so I just
oh, well, I'm
retain it.
sure you're pretty big. Um, was in February of 1989 when Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran issued a fatwa against Salman Rushdie. And I thought people in America and Europe responded very poorly to that because they didn't understand what was at stake. So a lot of them said things like, well, of course, it's not good to threaten to murder Salman Rushdie, but on the other hand, he did write an offensive book, and what do you expect? And there was a lot of that, and that was a moment when I thought, people don't really understand what it is we're defending here and why it's important, and that led to my writing a book on free speech and free thought called Kindly Inquisitors: The New Attacks on Free Thought. And meanwhile, at the same time, I was covering Washington and seeing the very beginnings of what would later become much worse trends in partisanship and dysfunction. And I started writing about that. And that led to another book the year after called Demosclerosis, which was about the sclerotic, maladaptive tendencies of governments, of democratic governments. And those were more than 30 years ago. So ever since then, I've There are a couple running themes in my work. One is same sex marriage and gay rights, and another is trying to understand liberal democracy and liberal science and how to protect and strengthen them.
Yeah, and that's fascinating that that it's so very vivid in your memory that this was the turning point, the fatwa issued against Rushdie. Um, initially, did it s- did it did it initially just click for you, say from the perspective of a journalist, like, hey, if they go after Rushdie, they could be coming after me next? Was it personalized initially, or did you initially just sort of trend towards the like, wait, how does this affect not just say my way to earn a living, but just there's something much more um, essential that's being threatened here?
It was the latter. I never felt personally threatened or that anyone would come after me or silence me. But the causality, I think, John, is maybe more in the opposite direction, which is I became a journalist out of a strong sense of curiosity and a strong belief in inquiry and asking questions in unfettered seeking after truth. That's been, I don't know even why this happens, but even in high school, I knew that free speech and free thought were what I cared about. I think it probably, in fact, almost certainly has to do with being simultaneously um, Jewish, gay, and atheist in a place and time when those things were all unwelcome. So I felt I was always an outsider. I was always the minority. I always understood that majority culture could crush me. And I think maybe that helped give me an awareness of the importance of free inquiry, free thought, other forms of
I
freedom.
can Yeah, I could certainly relate to that. I mean, just reading your bio, I think we're basically of the same generation, same influences. Um, and I remember myself, the thing that got me to move away from traditional conservatism during the Reagan years was the attack on rock lyrics. It wasn't necessarily Reagan; it was Al Gore and Tipper Gore specifically. But just saying to myself, like, if you're willing to attack lyrics in songs and attempt to ban songs, and then the next thing would be to attack, it just seemed me as highly anti-conservative in the sense that it put the government in a position of deciding what was wrong and what was right, and that seemed to be wholly un-American to me,
Well,
and
that's right.
probably push.
You and I are in a
I'm sorry.
minority, unfortunately. At my first newspaper job in the town of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, excuse me, in 1983, my first boss, the managing editor, loved to point out that if the First Amendment were put up for a vote, it would lose, and it wouldn't even be close. And unfortunately, folks like you and me have to get up every morning for the rest of our lives and defend free speech, free thought from scratch. And the same will be true of your children and grandchildren all the way down the line. The good news is, so far, we're doing okay.
We're doing okay, but do you agree that if I were to say that if we go back to the 80s when initially, say, you had the conservative movement tied into the, say, the fundamentalist movement, the fundamentalist Christian movement in the United States, um, would you say that the tolerance of free speech has, I mean, it's gone up and down in this country, I would say. But do you think, like, if we were to take snapshots, do you think we're more tolerant of free speech in our political and social discourse today, or even still back in the 80s, say, when you and I were first, say, pushed into this direction?
Well, this is a more complicated reply than you want, but it's more
Mm,
like there are always these pockets of free speech and pockets of attacks on free speech, and they move around. So
mm,
if you're gay and my age, born in 1960, the 70s and 80s were pretty terrible. There were rampant
right,
intrusions on our rights, not just free speech, but even the ability not to be criminals. Um,
right.
if you look at academia, on the other hand, starting in the 90s and then accelerating in this century, things got much worse. When I went to college, it was just understood that undergraduates could pretty much say and discuss anything they wanted. That was very different
Right.
by the time of 10 and 20 years ago. Um, we had we had big threats from McCarthyism in the 50s, but now we have the Trump administration attempting to use its regulatory power to intimidate its critics. So the way I look at it is kind of what I said before. The idea that ideas and speech that are obnoxious, uncomfortable, blasphemous, wrong-headed, and sometimes will really hurt someone's feelings, that should not only be allowed by the government, but protected by the government, is the most counterintuitive, crazy sounding social idea of all time, bar none. And its saving grace is just the fact that it is also the single most successful social idea of all time, bar none. It gives us freedom, peace, and knowledge. But we are never going to be done with trying to put out fires.
I find this a fascinating piece of collective psychology, Jonathan, in the sense that all of us can identify the speech that we hate, right? So, and I've been tempted myself. There was an incident, I think, in the early '90s on the Oprah Winfrey Show, where she decided to have some, hard right wing neo-Nazi guys on a panel. I think at the time with someone like Roy Innes, say, to have a quote debate, and she spouted the typical like, "Hey, the best disinfectant is light." That any speech, you have to protect any speech. And at the end of that episode, someone interviewed her because it turned into a melee on camera. She said, "I'll never do that again because all I did was empower those Nazis, those white supremacists." Um, do you sympathize with someone who holds that position? Like, I believe in free speech, but now I'm playing devil's advocate here because I think I know your answer. But would you like to address that? Like, for people who say, "Okay, I get it, we should," but what about people whose sole purpose is to be illiberal, whose sole purpose is to use free speech to destroy free speech? How do you respond to those people who say, "Hey, don't we draw a line somewhere when it comes to this?"
I would say it depends on whether the line drawer is, say, the United States government or, say, Big John. If
Mm,
the line drawer is Big John or Oprah Winfrey, someone with a program or a show or a platform, they should make editorial decisions. That's what we do in journalism all day. We call it editing. And in fact,
right,
that's the ability to decide not to platform speech is as central to the First Amendment as the ability to speak. I can't force my way onto your show. So,
mm,
I might disagree with Oprah Winfrey. I might agree with you in a situation, but we'll just have to talk about that and have different ideas and preferences. Of course, it is a different idea when we're talking about throwing Big John in jail because we think he's
right,
platforming bad or hateful ideas. Um, it
right,
turns out that governments are super bad at distinguishing ideas that are hateful and harmful from ideas that are unpleasant but true and important and need to be said. There are a lot of people who get canceled because they say affirmative action is counterproductive. Well, there's a lot of evidence that
right.
it is, actually. So we need to be able to talk about these things. And I tell my progressive friends, if you want an example of why it's a bad idea to give the government powers of censorship, I give you the Trump administration.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And speaking of which, do you because I find it fascinating. Again, the group psychology. If you're talking about the current administration and also the previous administration, the Biden administration to a large extent, but you know, the use of speech or the restriction of speech in the pursuit of some sort of national agenda, right? Why do you think that the populace is so willing to accept that? That why can't we look beyond, say, tomorrow to next week,
Well, I have to, in passing, put a stake in the ground and say that there is a false equivalence, a false both sidesing if someone says that the Biden administration was like the Trump administration on free speech. There is no comparison. What
I agree. The
Biden,
degree is.
we can
Go ahead.
get
I'm
into the
sorry. I didn't
weeds
mean to
on
interrupt.
this, but I don't want anyone to think that I endorse the idea that, Trump, Biden, they're both the same, they're both bad. That is simply not true. Trump is going places that no modern government has gone or should go, explicitly threatening networks with losing their license if the president and his cronies don't like what's being put on the air. That's just
Right.
horrifying. Throwing people out of the country because they write an op-ed piece. That's just horrifying. Um, Nothing like that under Biden or under Obama or under George H.W. Bush, et cetera, et cetera. So with that out of the way, I think it goes back to what we said earlier, which is
Mm,
that the idea that protecting speech, which can be blasphemous, harmful, obnoxious, wrongheaded, is just profoundly counterintuitive. And it's also, by the way, very, very new in human history. In fact, First Amendment protections as we know them in the United States really just get going in the 40s and get strong and really stood up in the 70s. It's the blink of an eye, right? So,
right.
so that means that we just have to re-explain every day why this first freedom is so important and why you can't trust any authority, especially including ourselves, to decide what other people can say and think. But unfortunately, it's just human nature.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's very unfortunate, and maybe it's a function. I don't know if you agree with this. Maybe it's a function that we've reached. You and I have reached a certain age that we've seen certain things repeat themselves, even in our lifetimes. You know how they say history always repeats itself. When you get to be in your 60s, 70s, you've maybe that's three human generations in essence, and in each one you could say I've seen the cycle play out before. Why won't anybody listen?
There's certainly something to that. We have learned the hard way. One of the things that most breaks my heart, John, is that I am a gay American. I am married to a husband, and it's not even controversial. Yet the world that I
Right.
grew up in 1960, when I was born, same sex relations were criminal in every single state. And don't say it wasn't enforced, because it was in all kinds of ways. Police stings, people would lose their jobs. We could not serve in the military. We, of course, could not get married. We could not walk the streets without fear of violence and terrorism. We were denounced from the pulpits as a stench in God's nostrils. All of that changed, not because we have votes, because we didn't, and not because we had money, because we didn't. It was because we had the power of speech. It was because we were able to use our ability to speak and to protest peacefully, with a couple important exceptions, um, to change people's minds. And by God, that's how we did it. That's how the women's suffrage movement did it. That's how the Black civil rights movement, that's how the trans movement is going to do it if they ever get their act together. And young people don't know this. Young people think that free speech, not every young person, but the polls show that the younger you get in America, the less you believe in the value of free speech. And young people tend to believe that free speech actually is a false front put up by status quo, powerful interests, colonialists and racists and people like that. The very opposite of the truth.
Do you find that to be a stunning turnaround from when
Yes.
you and I were in college?
Yes.
How do you think that? What do you think was the path to the Berkeley Free Speech movement to the younger people polling as being the most anti-free speech demographic in this country right now?
Yeah, we're showing our age. Do you think your listeners know what the Berkeley Free Speech movement was? This is in the
You're
1960s. Students,
right. Yeah.
students at Berkeley, undergraduates, in those days, the state universities could exert strong control over what could be said on campus, and the undergraduates said enough of that, and they mounted a protest, a famous peaceful protest, a guy named Mario Savio. Um,
Mhm.
and they stood up for free speech, and they won. It was great. Actually, no
Mm.
one of the people who was there, he's a friend of mine, lives not far away. So this is
Oh,
not
good.
ancient history when these battles were fought. Okay, so why did it switch? I don't actually think it's all that complicated. I think when you are out of power and when you don't have votes, money, or mass support, and you're relying on free speech, you understand that it's important. But then what happens is that progressives become power holding insiders in universities primarily, but also some of the other cultural institutions. And going back to what we said earlier, it's just human nature that when you're in power, you tend to want to suppress criticism and you tend to want to impose your views and you tend to believe you're right. So why shouldn't you? So we saw the rise starting in the late 80s, early 90s of speech codes in universities and the use of the idea of harassment to shut down speech, saying that it was discriminatory verbal harassment for me to criticize you. You had a kind of therapeutic movement, a safetyism that said if I hurt someone's feelings on campus, I violated their rights.
Right.
You had the rise of an ideology that said, as we just talked about, that free speech is really just a way that oppressors impose their will. And all of those things within universities, of course, flipped the power dynamics. So now the people who were the minority rights activists on the outside, being small, weak, and needing free speech, are now running the dean's office, the provost's office. They've got the activist groups on campus. There are a ton of the faculty. And they're in no mood to allow what they think is racist, sexist, or homophobic speech. And then this continues to the point where home truths become unsayable on campus. It becomes very hard to talk about abortion, affirmative action, transgender, homosexuality with more than one side. And here we are.
Yeah, and uh, as I said earlier, one of the things I admire about your approach is that you do kind of you have your opinions, but you're willing to understand the opposing opinions, and you're willing to engage with the opposite position, which is always a good approach, in my opinion, because you, in defending yourself to others, you're also re-examining your own held beliefs, right? Um,
Thank you.
but
That's a high compliment.
oh, you're welcome. I just meant it honestly, But here's the thing: I just can't understand how so the because to your point, one of the complaints, say in the late '80s, early '90s, if you were someone in academia, was a traditional academic, you would say, "Man, all those free speech kids are now running the universities." That's why the universities are so antithetical to traditionally conservative ideas, or like you'll read about Keynes, but you'll never read about Milton Friedman or Mises or somebody like that, right? Because the kids who fought for that free speech movement are now all running the universities. But to your point, that same demographic, now that they're hitting retirement age, but still in those key university positions, have enacted or did enact, have enacted, are enacting illiberal policies in the name of a liberal institution. Isn't that contradiction? Why do you think that contradiction is not as plainly obvious as it might be to the two of us?
Well, of course, everyone thinks that they're on the side of justice and goodness when they are in power and promote a speech code or what have you. So part of it is that, but part of it is, again, I know it gets complicated, answers can be tiresome, but it is true that universities wear multiple hats. So yes, there are places for the free exchange of ideas and unfettered inquiry. There are also residences where people live. And that means that if someone comes to them and says, I don't feel safe in my dorm because someone in the hallways is calling me the N word or what have you, the university will feel it has to act on that. So this can become difficult in a hurry, especially if you get confused about your fundamentals. So I'm a board member of a group called Heterodox Academy, which is, I'm not an academic, but it's a group for academics that want to propound viewpoint diversity and open civic engagement in universities. And our idea is that truth seeking is the supreme telos of the university, the supreme purpose. But it's not the only purpose. So what we advocate
Mm.
is that when these conflicts come up between, say, speech rights and someone feeling threatened or endangered, as of course they did in the campus protests against Israel after October 7th, that we should err on the side of free speech and open inquiry. If it's a true threat, for example, those can be restricted under the First Amendment, and they should be. If someone is being blocked from access to a part of campus, being physically harassed, being locked in a building, um, or being seriously threatened, that cannot be allowed to stand. But it's easy to get confused about these values, when you've got minority kids coming to you and saying, I really don't feel safe here. What are you going to do about it? Well, it's easy to get lost, and some people did. The good news, John, is that we are seeing a lot of improvement since
Mm.
peak woke in 2020. We just saw a report out of Yale, my alma mater, an absolutely outstanding report by a special commission of 10 professors who state clearly that the university lost its way trying to do too much, be too many things to too many people, and that it needs to reinstate truth seeking as its primary, not only, but primary mission. We're seeing universities around the country begin to open viewpoint diversity centers, the schools of civic thought, for example. We're seeing new attention being paid to the importance of free speech. And the activists, the people, the illiberal group were never really a majority on campus to begin with. They were very good at manipulating the apparent consensus using intimidation and social media and investigations and cries of pain and suffering. But there's always been a constituency out there for good old fashioned free thought. And those people are feeling more empowered now to come forward.
Yeah, and I love what you said, but it's sometimes, Jonathan, when I'm by myself here or I'm working through some notes, I just say it just seems that if you were just reasonable in this situation, you could come to an accommodation for everyone. But of course, that's very vague, right? Even in my own head, what's reasonable? What's not reasonable? When am I the arbiter? What's reasonable, right? For example, someone wearing a Halloween costume that is from a race not their own, from a culture not their own. I don't view that as threatening. And I would venture a guess that most reasonable people would not. But then again, I find myself asking, who am I to decide if that's reasonable or not? And do you find that what you just stated, while I agree with it 100%, right? Obviously, physical violence cannot be tolerated in the name of the free exchange of ideas or whatever. Um, when you did have situations like that, and who is that professor, Christakis, who
Yeah, Nicholas
like
Christakis.
the Nicholas Christakis, that image of him just standing surrounded by a mob, calmly addressing what were aggressions and what weren't aggressions is almost burned into my memory. Um, do you how do you set up what would be a reasonableness council if I want to create a phrase here?
Well, there are always going to be hard cases, but the first thing you do
Right.
is you have policies that are set in advance. Because if you try to respond to each incident on the fly, you'll just be like the
Right.
sailboat that tacks left and right, but never gets anywhere. So you have to state
Mm.
your values up front as a university, and then you have to have some rules and procedures and some protections for free speech, so that you're not flying blind when the crisis comes. And you can say, look, here's how we handle that. Here's what our values are. So that's number one. Number two is you have to have administrators who are trained in those values, and you have to promulgate those values from day one, from freshman orientation. You need to tell students, um, this is a free speech university, and here's what that means. Best way to do that turns out not to be lectured by faculty, but for students to talk about free speech. University of South Florida has a wonderful program created by students in their freshman orientation that involves students doing skits about how to handle tense situations. Like someone comes to campus who's a preacher who's preaching that every fetus is, a human life and abortion is murder. What do you do about that? Um, the you should print those values in your catalog. You should tell the world what it is you believe. And if you don't want to be a free speech university and you're private, okay, um, say so. Say, we're a Baptist university and we're not going to tolerate blasphemy here. Um, so, so do all of those things. Um, and I guess above and beyond that, the thing about the First Amendment to the US Constitution, it limits what the government can do. It only applies to the government. So officially, it only applies to state publicly funded universities. But there's a really good thing about it, which is it has some clear principles that are well articulated, have been thoroughly litigated, and pretty much everyone understands. So when private universities say we're going to be guided by the First Amendment in making these decisions, they don't have to make it up. There's a lot, we know a lot about the difference between a true threat versus a general statement. And so that's the last thing that they can do, is they can commit themselves to the values of the First Amendment. And that makes a very good starting point because you don't have to start from scratch.
Right, I agree with you. And I've always been a proponent of the spirit of the First Amendment, not the legal definition of the First Amendment, because I agree, X comes to mind as a very vivid example of, I think, that sharp difference, right? Because um, that platform does more to create these echo chambers and these vocal minorities that give the impression that they're the majority. I mean, I love what you said, that like when you had this overcorrection to the other side on campuses where everything was a microaggression, everything was an assault, speech as violence, um, that was an overcorrection. And then you look at X being overcorrected when it went from, say, Dorsey to Musk, um, being overcorrected in the other direction. And again, I've always maintained that it's a very vocal minority. It's not the majority of Americans. It's not representative of our society as a whole. Um, do you still feel that's the case? That when you said there was always just a vocal minority on campuses that were really tilting things. Do you feel that's also the case nationally for us?
Oh, well, we've got polling on this, and we know that there are consistent percentages of students. I could actually bring them up here on my computer if you want real numbers. I don't have a head for numbers, so I can't remember. But depending on the question you ask, there's 10 to 25% of students who will say that it is okay to shout down a speaker, for example, or that people who have really harmful ideas should not be allowed on campus. Or at an extreme, there's like, I think it's 4 or 5% that will endorse violence as a way to prevent speech. Most students do not answer the question that way. Most students will say that they favor free speech and that they do not favor deplatforming. Now, they're easily confused about this. When you show them actual situations, they can come out all over the map. But the minority that wants to do speech codes and so forth, it's a substantial minority. It's not like 1%. Depending on
Right.
the
Yeah.
issue, what we're talking about, it can be anywhere from 10 to 30 or 40%. But that's right. It is not an outright majority. Here's the bad news, John, which is when you do surveys of authoritarian attitudes, people who answer yes to questions like, do you agree that sometimes the president should override Congress in order to get things done? The younger people are in the United States, the more they agree with that. Now, it's still not a majority, even among the young, but younger equals more authoritarian in this country. And that's, I don't have to tell you, that's not boding super well for the future.
It doesn't. And again, it's stunning that in my lifetime, I went from the don't trust anyone over 30 to the younger people, as you said, a sizable minority saying, like, yeah, we need a strong man. We need someone who'll take charge and be heavy handed and iron fisted. It is, with the benefit of a lived experience, it is stunning to me that 180 has occurred in my lifetime, at least in the United States. let me transition a little bit. Oh, if you're talking to someone who's, say, a traditional progressive or a liberal in this country who happens to read Jonathan Rauch, they might be a little concerned, or they might say, "What's going on here?" To find out that perhaps you would say that there were some positives to come out of Christian values in the United States, that there might be some liberal benefits from an illiberal construct like the Christian faith or the Christian church. First of all, do you agree with what I just said? And if so, why would you hold that position?
Well, you just asked about my whole last book, so how much time do you have? Um, I do agree with that position. I once was, not even all that long ago, 25 years ago, someone who thought America would be better off if it were more secular and less religious. And I wrote that for The Atlantic in 2003. And, as Keynes probably did not actually say, when the facts change, sir, I change my mind. What do you do? In the past, well, since the turn of the century, we have seen an unprecedented dechurching in America. Right through the 20th
Yes.
century, 70 to 75% of Americans were affiliated with a church. Now it's under half. And at last check, falling. It may be stabilizing, but at a low level. And my prediction did not come through. People did not become less divided, less angry and antagonistic when religion began to fade, when Christianity specifically, which is, of course, America's predominant religion, began to fade.
Right.
Instead, they substituted pseudo-religions. And, those could be anything from Wicca crystals to Soul Cycle or whatever. Um, but they also included toxic partisanship. And people increasingly look to their partisan identities with kind of apocalyptic fervor. And
Mm,
then, in yet another step, they brought that apocalyptic political sensibility back into church. And they started going to the pastor and saying, look, we're under siege in this country. We're losing the culture war to the radical left. So we have to go a on a spiritual warfare to win power in this country. And then they endorse Donald Trump because he promises them power, which further corrupts the church and leads to a continuation of this cycle of shrinkage and partisanship. And meanwhile, instead of looking to God for their transcendent values, looking at, there's bad stuff in the Bible and good stuff in the Bible, but there's, depending on your religion, 2,000 to 3,000 years there of accumulated wisdom that remains bedrock morality for many people. And if instead you're looking to your political party, your tribe for that, you're in a world that's ungovernable and where people become angry and unmoored. So, yeah, I have
mm.
come to feel that the experiment in secularization has failed. Now, I'm not saying it's a Christian nation. We should write it into the Constitution. You have to be a Christian to be a good American. Nothing like that. I'm not a Christian nationalist. Neither were the founders. But what I am saying is exactly what the founders said, which is Washington and Adams and Madison and others, they all told us, we can give you a structure of government, but we can't give you what they call the Republican virtues, in modern language, the values that underpin that government: civility, decency, treating others as your equal, lawfulness, truthfulness, forbearance. You're going to have to get those from other places. And that's going to be your family, your community, civic organizations, but they fully expected that it would be Christianity. So they assigned a mission to Christianity, which is promulgate the values that will help uphold a democracy. Well, we've seen secularization and we've seen corruption of the Christian witness, and I think the founders' fears are coming true.
Do you think there's ever a way to maintain what you would view as the positive principles, the positive uh, guardrails, if you want to use that term, of Christianity or organized religion, but just divorce publicly the spiritual angle of it? Like, so do you think whatever you think those Republican values are that would have been derived from Christianity or had been derived from Christianity? Is there a way to divorce them per se from Christianity and just maintain those, much like we have our Bill of Rights, say?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think to some extent it depends on the individual. I'm an atheist. At one point I tried believing and I couldn't. I just don't have the faith gene, if there is one. But I'm a pretty decent law-abiding person. Um, so I don't think it's necessary to be religious to be a good citizen. Far from it. On the other hand, I do think what we've learned in the last quarter century, and some would say last millennium, is that everything else gets harder if people don't have ways to gather together and focus on higher things in life, to think and talk about values and transmit those values to their kids. If there aren't wisdom traditions that are older than we are ourselves, if you tell people like Nietzsche that God is dead, so you're just going to have to go out and make up your own values, but since you're probably too stupid to do that, I'm going to make them up.
Right.
That turns out not to be a good plan. So back to your question, can you have a secular society that's every bit as good and just and fair and happy as a Christian society? I think some people would point to Scandinavia. Of course, some people would point to Japan, which isn't Christian at all. Very decent, stable, good society. So it's clearly possible to do it. I just think it's harder, especially it's harder in America, because we don't have that cultural and ethnic homogeneity to fall back on. A country like Japan, it's full of Japanese people, and it has a really hard time amid a population crash. It can't absorb immigrants. It's but we can, and we do, and we've relied on Christianity for years as one of the ways that we inculcate our values.
Right.
So
It,
the answer is maybe.
I kind of, yeah, yeah.
I mean, we'll
Again,
find
I
out
think
because we're dechurching so fast. We're going to have to live in,
we're,
maybe have to live in a world without God.
yeah, and sort of transitioning maybe to the closing thought based on that, which is, do you see hope for America returning to what you and I would consider to be what it was at its best? At its, we're in a bad state politically, not just with the Trump administration, of which I am no fan, but one could argue that we're just what we're experiencing, say, the last 25 years have just been these pendulum swings where at every cyclical turn, the bob is now heading to a higher state on either side, right? It doesn't tend to vibrate towards the middle, but like the progressive DEI wokeness, if I'm using general terms, that was a little bit too high on the left side. Now with the second Trump administration, we're way on the other side on the right. And I fear that if progressives take control again, are they going to bring the bob and kind of force it towards the middle again, or are they going to go even higher up on the left side? Uh, to me, that's a question I don't think I can answer with any sort of confidence. How about you? What do you think?
I also can't answer it with confidence. I think 20 years ago, I had a, a pretty strong faith in the basic decency of the American people. And um, now I still have that faith in a lot of the American people, but it's just become, alas, clear that millions and millions of Americans will endorse some morally abhorrent ideas and behaviors. And we could talk about what some of those are. I can give you chapter and verse. So it's a fight. I don't feel complacent. Um, there's a lot of sort of mechanical reasons why it is hard to occupy the center in politics right now. They have to do with the primary system and the weakness of the parties as institutions and social media and non-social media and lots of other things that militate against moderation and centrism. So, I'm about to be 66. Men in my family die at 80. I don't know that it'll turn around in my lifetime. I tell young
Mm,
audiences, like one yesterday, a college audience, guys, this is up to you. Big
Right.
John and I, we're checking out. We're collecting our fat Social Security, Medicare checks, bankrupting the country, and leaving you to fix it. I don't know.
Right.
Can they?
Yeah.
They don't believe in
Yeah.
institutions the way we do, and they haven't seen a Congress ever that really works, so they don't really know what that looks like. But they do want to rebuild. They know something is wrong with the world.
Yeah, I see it in my niece and nephew and a lot of the kids that I've mentored in other disciplinary fields, that I won't say it's hopelessness on their part. I would say it's that like whereas you and I maybe had faith in free enterprise, had faith in the Constitution, those liberal, classical liberal principles. I To your point, I don't think that I think young people today sense something is wrong. I just don't think that they have the sense also that the solution lies in the same principles that we once held so sacrosanct, so dear. So to your point, I'm hopeful, but I don't know that I'm confident either.
We're in exactly the same place, John. There's a wonderful book, many wonderful books by Yuval Levin, who I think is the most important conservative writer in the country right now. And he makes the point, the thing about institutions is when they fail and go away, um, people don't respond to that by saying, by God, we've got to go out and build a new institution. You get a generation that comes along, all they know is that something is missing, but it's like not having enough vitamins or minerals. You don't feel good, but you don't know why, because you don't know what it is that you haven't had. And so the question's going to be, can subsequent generations figure this out and build the kinds of institutions that they're going to need? Floating in
Mm.
this big, amorphous, nihilistic sea in which you don't trust anyone and you don't believe in institutions and you think your fellow citizens are dangerous and evil, that's just not going to work.
Yeah, it's not sustainable, and it doesn't lead to any sort of increased happiness. All right, Jonathan Rauch, thank you so much. I would love to talk to you even more, but I know you're time constrained. But I hope you have a couple of more minutes left because I always like to end my interviews on what I call the final five. These are just five rapid fire questions, apropos of nothing, just to give us a little bit better understanding of yourself. Okay, number one, assume you're barred from using the words liberal, epistemic, norms, or institutions for the rest of this conversation. In one sentence, what do you stand for?
I'm sure you have not asked that question of anyone else. I stand for all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Brilliant. Great answer.
I made that up myself.
In your book,
Spur
The
of the
Happiness
moment.
in your book, The Happiness Curve, you argued that getting older makes you happier. Are you now actually happier, or are you just better at rationalizing where you are at life?
I'm happier. The demons of sense of failure and thwarted ambition that I had in my 40s have dissipated, and now, despite the dark things that we've been talking about, I wake up every morning feeling literally grateful.
That's a great spot. I'm glad to hear that. Great. You've written about the illiberal left and the illiberal right with what you call even handedness. Which side's criticism of your even handedness do you think is more accurate, more correct?
The left.
You feel the left, like when you get criticism from the left, you feel it's more accurate than when you get criticism from the right.
Yes, they're asking harder questions and they're doing it with more integrity. They are genuinely concerned about having a fairer country to minorities, and some of them are cynical and want power, but others are challenging the things that I believe in because they really think they can make a better world. The right these days, the MAGA right in particular, um, what can you say about some of those folks? They're platforming Nazis. I don't really think they're on the level.
There's certainly not too much sincerity coming from that corner. You walk into a room and discover James Madison, George Orwell, and a modern university administrator arguing over free speech. Who do you quietly stand next to as a sign of support?
James Madison, George Orwell, and a university administrator. That's an interesting combination. I'm going to go stand next to the university administrator because I'm a member of an organization that's doing exactly that. We are Heterodox Academy. All of you guys should look it up. Yes, we're a nonprofit. We love donations. We especially love members. And we are creating a national network of thousands of faculty at universities that are literally doing what you just said, which is standing with presidents and administrators who are working to reform universities from within. And that's the way you fix it, right? You've got to have change agents on the inside who will rediscover their basic mission and recommit to it. Not that there's anything wrong with Orwell or Madison.
I didn't think there were. It was meant to be a tough question. Okay, last question. What's a book you think is wrong about almost everything, but you find yourself recommending to others anyway?
Wrong about almost everything. I'm going to go with a book that came out in, I think, 1970. It's called The Pursuit of Loneliness. It's by Philip Slater. This was a big book in its time. It's forgotten today, but it's about how consumerism has devalued human life in American society, hollowed it out. And it's from the left, but it calls for capitalism with stronger, more spiritual type values. And I read it when I was like 15. I was deeply influenced. I reread it recently, and it's kind of wacky, and it's kind of limited to its period. And yet there's some really important things in there, and he's prescient. He's writing 55 years ago, and he foresees some of the same enemy and emptiness and anger that you and I have been talking about. So go back and have a look. Wrong but important.
Okay, wrong but important. Fair enough. All right, everyone. Jonathan
And
Rauch, thank you for joining us. Please give us maybe the Heterodox Academy's website or anything else you want to let us know about.
can I tell it to you and you can put it in show notes? I think
Absolutely.
we're heterodoxacademy.org. It's a bit long, but
Okay.
heterodoxacademy.org, or if you Google the three letters HXA, it will pop right up.
Okay. So we'll have that in the show notes. Thank you, everyone, for joining The Big Question with Big John. Until next time, peace.